by angels with visions of the future.
You read the Bible.
Yeah.
That's in there?
Of terror and destruction.
Well, yeah, that's the funny thing is like
Complete.
99% of all objections to any kind of biblical truth can be cured just by reading the Bible. Alright, so I'm glad you all enjoyed this. That's covering a little bit of the truth we're actually covering this week. So we're actually talking about the resurrection. Right after Easter, so I guess it's rather fitting that we get this in. So I'm going to get us started live here. Oh, I guess we've been live the whole time, interestingly enough, so I guess I'll have to trim that first few minutes off the video. But that's alright, so amazingly enough, of all of the material that we've covered since we've started the class, this is of the utmost importance as being part of our Christian witness, but it's amazingly enough the easiest to defend of all that we're going to be covering in all of our classes. So this week we're going to be talking about, is the resurrection account accurate? And we'll be covering a number of different objections to the resurrection, which I think we have a nice little comedic excursion into that right there. And then we're also going to be covering first all the evidence that we have sustaining the historicity of the resurrection. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started here so we don't stick around here too late. Let everybody finish up their pizza. Okay. Oh, those are nice sandwiches.
Yeah, toasted.
That's better than Quiznos. Are there any Quiznos left? No. Yeah, I still love them. So, a method common. Okay, so we're starting with historical evidence. So, a method commonly used today to determine historicity of an event is inference to best explanation. This is an approach where we begin with the evidence available to us and then infer what would, if true, provide the best explanation of that evidence. In other words, we have to accept an event as historical if it gives the best explanations for the evidence surrounding it. So, the inference of best explanation is just going to be the matter of you take all your evidence and what weighs up. You know, like we can see that we have all this food on the table. There's a bunch of books on the table. Then we must have some sort of a class around dinner time. So that's just taking common evidence and turning that into a conclusion. So when we look at the evidence, the truth of the resurrection emerges very clearly as the best explanation. There is no other theory that can come close to accounting for the evidence. Therefore, there's solid historical grounds for the truth that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And you remember we were talking about the weight of evidence. So what we're going to be dealing with from skeptics is people wanting to claim the validity of our evidence. And this is what we're going to be able to present here. And you can also get pushback on why they're putting such high standards on the evidence. Remember, I told you a couple classes ago that it's actually a compliment when an atheist says, this extraordinary claim requires extraordinary evidence, because they do realize the significance of what this means if the evidence is true. This basically states that the Christian account is right, and then they have to have an account of their life. They have to say, okay, God, this was you who resurrected. So I just want to kind of give a preface and a little a callback to a couple classes ago when dealing with evidence that we're going to get in pushback. So, it's worth pointing out that in establishing the historicity of the resurrection, we do not need to assume that the New Testament is inspired by God or even trustworthy. While I do believe these things, we are going to focus here on three truths that even critical scholars admit. In other words, these three truths are so strong that they're accepted by serious historians of all stripes. Therefore, any theory must be able to adequately account for all this data. So, what this basically says is, even in academia, secular academia, most atheist historians will accede to the evidence of the resurrection. I mean, will they say it means what it was, and then they have a bunch of other arguments as to who Jesus actually was, but they will accede to all this evidence, as in evidence for anything historical. Remember I told you, I think probably after second class, about we have less evidence for Alexander the Great than we do for anybody in the New Testament. Yeah, exactly. So, with that being said, you have to push back as in why are they judging this level of history at a different standard than other historical events or historical people. So the three main truths we have for the resurrection is one, the tomb in which Jesus was buried was discovered empty by a group of women on the Sunday following the crucifixion. Two, Jesus' disciples had real experiences with whom they believed was the risen Christ, and as a result of the preaching of these disciples, which had the resurrection at its center, the Christian church was established and grew. So, I think I'm not get ahead of myself on here, but virtually all scholars who deal with the resurrection, whatever their school of thought, assent to these three truths. We will see that the resurrection of Christ is the best explanation for each of them individually. But then we will see even more significantly that when these facts are taken together, we have an even more powerful case for the resurrection, because the skeptic will not have to explain away just one historical fact, but three. These three truths create a strongly woven three-cord rope that cannot be broken. So, in addressing the first part, I'm moving a little bit quick here, so if you all have questions, don't hesitate to ask, but I want to get to the material quickly. So I think this is mostly cut and dry and straightforward. We're not dealing with a lot of high-end philosophical premises here. So first, the empty tomb. To begin, what is the evidence that the empty tomb in which Jesus was buried was discovered empty by a group of women on the Sunday? God, I'm not reading this right. To begin, what is the evidence that the tomb in which Jesus was buried was discovered empty by a group of women on the Sunday following the crucifixion? Okay, first, the resurrection was preached in the same city where Jesus had been buried shortly before. Jesus' disciples did not go to some obscure place where no one had heard of Jesus to begin preaching about the resurrection, but instead began preaching in Jerusalem, the very city Jesus had died and been buried. No one would be foolish enough to believe a man had been raised from the dead when his body lay dead and the tomb for all to see. So anybody who wanted to be able to account for the evidence, it was right there for them. So if they wanted to, if this had happened in, say, Calcutta, India, they start preaching in, say, Barcelona, Spain, and that's rather suspect, because nobody can go and confer. Or if it had happened like 500 years before in the past.
Well, one thing that's kind of crazy is even if you look at historical documents, they don't say Jesus didn't raise from the dead. They make up excuses for why his body wasn't in the tomb.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, we talk about a lot of some of, God, just going brain dead on the material. Yeah, we're going to cover it a little bit later, but a lot of the post-temple Jewish literature. I think it's something Masoretic text.
Well, I'm just making a distinction because if you've ever looked at like police interrogations of people who weren't guilty, they won't even ask why they were arrested. They'll just be like, "So what's going on? Like, what do you guys?" You know what I mean? They won't ever ask like, "Why am I here? Why was I arrested?" They'll be more like, "Oh, what are you guys doing? Like, what are you guys doing?"
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They want to know what they know. They're not even asking why they were arrested.
Yeah, I think you're touching into J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity.
Oh, I don't know. I've never read or anything of his.
Oh, okay. Well, that's.
I wanted to.
Yeah, you're actually touching into it. So it's a really good book if you all want to get into it. But there's also a lot of videos he presents online. But he's a cold case police detective in L.A. or Orange County area, and he's applied his methods of interrogating different people, murder suspects, and be able to cross-examine their testimony to actually get a clear picture of the truth. This kind of forensic, forensic testimonial evidence is well documented within police work, and he decided to apply this. He actually went from becoming an atheist to a Christian by applying this methodology to reading the Gospels, and then he was able to draw a very strong conclusion using this scientific forensic technique to affirm the veracity of the Bible, especially the Gospel accounts.
And again, his goal in investigating the claims of the risen Christ was to disprove them.
Yeah, exactly. He was an atheist trying to prove God wrong, prove the Bible wrong, and actually proving himself a Christian. Okay, so second, the earliest Jewish arguments against Christianity admit the empty tomb, as we were talking about. In Matthew 28:11-15, there is a reference made to the Jews attempted to refute Christianity by saying that the disciples stole the body. This is significant because it shows that the Jews did not deny the empty tomb. Instead, their stolen body theory admitted the significant truth that the tomb was in fact empty.
So, how do they, if they say the body was stolen, how do they deal with the fact that the Roman soldiers didn't stop the body from being stolen? Because there was like, what, a legion or, there were a lot of soldiers.
Yeah.
Right, but that's the interest.
So how did they,
body?
yeah, so how, if the Jews admit the tomb was empty and they say the body was stolen, how do they account for the Roman soldiers not stopping it? Because if the Roman soldiers didn't stop it, those soldiers could be killed for not fulfilling their duty.
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, for something like that, it was the soldiers and their families. I mean, they would have wiped out interior, like complete line lineage. Like, it wasn't just the soldiers, man, they would have went after, talk about Rome here.
Yeah, and dereliction of duty, yeah. As I said, I'm probably going to need to look this up when I get home, but there is a Jewish writing from the period that does act as a polemic, but I know it doesn't really deal with that account. But I'll dig it up and I'll email that to you with the next class. So I don't want to speak on something I'm not 100% certain about, but I do know that there is writing on the material, and I'll get it to you later. But yeah, that's actually a very key piece of evidence, because you're basically, instead of, your inference of best explanation would be either the evidence stacks up that Jesus' body was not in the tomb for whatever reason, and as your best evidence going to be his resurrected, or a conspiracy theory that you have negligible proof of. So, and then that becomes, we go back to that concept of the explanation that has the least amount of, let's see, supporting proof that's not verifiable, or you don't have to stack it up with a huge web of other sub-explanations, which would be considered a conspiracy theory at that point in time, is typically the most likely explanation. So.
Well, you know, what else he said, if you look at Matthew 28:11-15, it talks about that when the elders were assembled and they got their little act together, they gave large sums of money to the soldiers and told them to say, you know, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we slept, and if this come to the governor's ears, we will persuade him and secure you. So they took the money and did as they were taught, and this same is commonly reported among the Jews today. So
Yeah, I forgot that was in Matthew. Yeah.
So they paid them off and said, we'll make sure that
We're gonna make sure
do anything to you.
Yeah.
That nobody does anything to you.
Yeah.
We're not governor.
All that was popping in my mind, if you ever had the chance to see the movie, was the movie Risen, where it covers the same.
Oh, yeah,
materials.
it's good.
And I'm like, I'm not going to quote a movie as being a biblical evidence. So, yeah, thank you very much for bringing that up, Beverly. But yeah, so that's the concept is that they paid off the guard, but then that's a whole other conspiracy in and of itself.
Well, it says as much in the Gospels. They paid the guards. So
Yeah.
They say that they were asleep.
Yes,
You know.
but then that falls back to the same issue. Is that even if the guards had been asleep, they'd still fall into the same level of punishment from their centurion.
Because of dereliction of duty.
Exactly.
They were supposed to stay awake all night and guard the tomb.
Yeah. So what amount of money would cover your debt? You know.
Well, if I remember correctly, when the leaders asked for a guard for the tomb, they were told, no, you have your own guard. You guard that tomb. So these soldiers that were guarding the tomb were evidently regular guards for the Jewish leadership.
Yeah.
In other words, they were not from a true Roman acting military, you know.
Yeah.
So they probably didn't have that much interest.
Here's the challenge, though. I do recall there were temple guards and there were actual Roman occupation guards both at the tomb. I think it was the argument that Caiaphas was stating that there was not going to be, that it wouldn't remain objective, that there would still be accusations if it was his guard. So they wanted the Roman guards there so they could not be held to account if the tomb was empty.
we're trying to cover all their bases, but obviously, no, the truth.
Exactly. So that's where I'm going back to the whole concept of most of these objections are quickly countered just by reading the Bible. And okay, so here is one of the pieces of Jewish writing that I was going to talk about. The Toledot Yasul, a compilation of early Jewish writings, is another source acknowledging this. It acknowledges that the tomb was empty and attempts to explain it away. Further, we have a record of 2nd century debate between a Christian and a Jew, in which a reference is made to the fact that the Jews claimed the body was stolen. So it is well established that the early Jews admitted the empty tomb, and if you all want references to this material, we'll send it in an email. So these are earlier writings going over the same sources. So what I'm trying to cover is, for us, we know the internal biblical sources, but I'm trying to go out in the external sources. Is most people who we're going to be having our apologetic conversations with aren't going to be, at first, considering the Bible as a viable source material to persuade them otherwise. For us, it's like, oh yeah, it's in the Bible. It's clear, but for them, they're going to be like, okay, give me something real, give me some science here. So third, the empty tomb account in the Gospel of Mark is based on the source that originated within 7 years of the event it narrates. This places the evidence for the empty tomb too early to be legendary, and it makes it much more likely that it is accurate. What is the evidence for this? Well, first, it's two pieces. First, a German commentator on Mark, Rudolf Tesch, points out that this pre-Markan source never mentions the high priest by name. This implies that Caiaphas, who we know was the high priest at the time, was still high priest when the story began circulating. Or if it had been written after Caiaphas' term of office, his name would have had to have been used to distinguish him from the next high priest. But since Caiaphas was high priest from AD 18 to 37, the story began circulating no later than AD 37, within the first 7 years after the events. And second, that since Paul's traditions concerning the Last Supper, written in 56 AD in 1 Corinthians 11, presuppose the Markan account, that implies that the Markan source goes right back to the early years of Christianity. So, the early source of Mark used puts the testimony of the empty tomb too early to be legendary. Third, the empty tomb is supported by the historical reliability of the burial story. New Testament scholars agree that the burial story is one of the best established facts about Jesus. One reason for this is because of the inclusion of Joseph of Arimathea as one of who buried Jesus. Joseph was a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, a sort of Jewish Supreme Court. People in this ruling class were simply too well known for their fictitious stories about them to be pulled off in this way. This would have exposed the Christians as fraud, so they couldn't have circulated the story about him burying Jesus unless it was true. Fourth, Jesus' tomb was never venerated as a shrine. This is striking because it was the first century custom to set up a shrine at the site of a holy man's bones. There were at least 50 such sites in Jesus' day. Since there was no such shrine for Jesus, it suggests that his bones weren't there. And I meant to get a picture here. Good?
We lost.
Yeah, we're lost.
I think third was fifth, so.
Oh, yeah. I edited.
Fourth was actually fifth.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Fourth is actually fifth.
I had to do an edit there because I was.
It's all materials there, it's just the number.
Got it. Okay.
Okay, so we should be on fifth. Yes. Yeah, I jumped ahead in writing this. So the interesting thing is that they found the ossuary of Caiaphas. So this guy is known as the historical fact, and an ossuary is a bone box. So when they put somebody in a tomb, so Jesus had not been resurrected, what would have happened was they would have put him in a tomb for a couple of years until all the flesh had rotted away, and then they would have opened the tomb back up, pulled out the bones, and put them in a special box and kept it. And since then, archaeologists have found James, brother Jesus' ossuary, Caiaphas' ossuary, and many other prominent biblical figures' ossuaries.
They recently found Pilate.
Yep, they found his grave, an inscription. Exactly.
His grave or his Colosseum?
No, it was his. I don't know. They buried Romans got buried differently than the Jews did. I think they actually found his actual grave.
Yeah, they found
It says,
right.
yeah, it was Pilate.
Yeah.
Well, the marker says Pilate. So
Yeah, that's
Pontificus Pilate or
Yeah.
something along those nature. Something along
yeah.
So it's crazy. All the guys that were guilty of persecuting and murdering Jesus are now have graves and he lives. So
Yeah, exactly.
no.
Yeah, and you can actually go to the garden tomb up to this day. It's still empty up to this day, of course, but we know where it's at now, which is really interesting. It was gone for quite some time.
Who was it that, what is it, like, probably 10 or 13 years ago at this point, where they said they had found the tomb of Jesus and it had bones in it and all that. And then CNN ran, it was actually on 60 Minutes, and CNN ran the story. And of course, they never retracted it, but
Yeah.
like 6 months later, of course, all true Christians around the world knew that the story was false, but it was proven to be false.
Yeah.
It was all a hoax.
Yeah, I don't know.
About
this
6
one,
months
but
later,
so
it
many-
was around 2007, 2010 type of time frame.
Yeah, I'm not 100% certain because I do think there was some, I vaguely remember something around that time frame when I was doing some research a few years ago. But yeah, there's so many, it seems like every year there are so many conspiracy theories or like these kind of crazy objections to any kind of historicity of the Bible. And especially the proliferation of social media, I can't even keep up with it anymore.
Well, yeah, and then, James Cameron, he's for about the past 20 years, he's been all over Jerusalem, and he's been paying for archaeological digs because he's dead set on finding Jesus' tomb. And I mean, my goodness, gosh, man, how many millions does a guy have to just before?
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting what he finds, but I'm not.
Well, he had actually. Well, it's funny because he actually said he found the tomb of Jesus. He goes, well, we believe this is the tomb of Jesus, and it's like some sort of documentary they made about, and another one about 10 years ago. He's like, we believe we found the tomb of Jesus, and I was like, dude, you did find it.
Yeah.
And here I am, I'm not even a Christian at this point. I was like, there's one thing I know.
Yeah, I would have been skeptical as well too.
And then,
like another Geraldo trying to find that vault.
But the funny thing is that they did find a tomb with the name Yeshua on it. However, the next day they also found like 20 other tombs with the name Yeshua. It was like what Mike is for us.
Yeah.
It's nuts how many people were named that. That one and Simon. I mean, both those names.
Yeah, exactly. How many Simeons or Shimons do we have in the New Testament?
Yeah, the first century alone.
Yeah, exactly. The funny thing is, Jesus in English is Josh. How many Joshes do you know?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
I know when Jesus married my sister.
In
Spanish.
Yeah, that was something that I found rather interesting when I.
He doesn't like to be called Jesus.
Yeah.
Everybody calls him Jesse.
Jesse.
My mom and dad named me his first back.
Yeah.
No, I'll go by Jesse.
Yeah.
Everybody calls him Uncle Jesse.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's a very common.
It is a very common name. Yeah. Being raised in I was raised half of my life in a Hispanic family. But the first half I wasn't exposed to it, so I found it rather kind of odd. And then until finally they pointed out to me, well, you have a friend named Josh? I'm like, oh yeah. That means that comes from Jesus too. I'm like, oh, okay, fair enough. So yeah, I thought it was like a little bit odd that name should be so sacred and holy. Nobody else in existence should ever have that name.
Yeah.
There was literally a million Jesuses in Jerusalem at that time.
Exactly. So, fifth, and probably sixth on your paper, Mark's account of the empty tomb is simple and shows no signs of legendary development. This is very apparent when we compare it with the Gospel of Peter, a forgery from about 125 AD. This legend has that all the Jewish leaders, Roman guards, and many people from the countryside gathered to watch the resurrection. Then 3 men came out of the tomb with their heads reaching up to the clouds. Then a talking cross comes out of the tomb. This is what legend looks like, and we see none of this in Mark's account, or of the empty tomb, or anywhere else in the Gospels. The sixth, seventh on your sheet, the tomb was discovered by women. And why is this important, you ask? Because the testimony of women in first century Jewish culture was considered worthless, if the empty tomb story were a legend, then it was most likely that the male disciples would have been made first to discover the tomb. The fact that despised women, whose testimony was deemed worthless, were the chief witnesses to the act of the empty tomb can only be plausibly explained if, like it or not, they were actually the discoverers of the empty tomb. And that's typically called I think it's the theory of embarrassment we were talking about. Back in all ancient historical writings, when somebody was writing a personal history, they always made themselves out to be the most highest grand person.
Oh yeah, massive plan.
Oh, whatever, I defeated so many people, I was so great that I conquered all these people, and it would have never been anything like, oh yeah, they defeated me in this battle, or I was my prophet told me to go pound sand. You would have never had anything like that in any ancient writing. So this is rather goes against all historical grains that they would have said, okay, the lowliest of the low people were giving accounts for Jesus' resurrection. Like you would never hear anything like that in ancient documentation.
Yeah, it makes it very unique amongst ancient documents.
Yeah.
Especially when people try to use it to prove your evidence.
Exactly. There's a lot of pushback you get into academia on that, but that's just it goes without saying anything in academia.
Well, that just proves that Jesus was woke.
Well, he was what?
He was woke.
He was woke. He was awake.
Literally.
Yeah.
Jesus was woke.
Be careful, a lot of people wouldn't say that.
You know,
Yeah, I know. That's why I said it.
That's a word that I like. It baffles me. I've never heard it other than people trying to put it down.
Yeah, it just means awaken to a critical consciousness. It is the actual.
That means everybody that's not woke is not awakened to critical consciousness.
Exactly.
Because they say so.
Yeah, well, at least the theory behind it. I think it says exactly.
Well, I think they're spinning their wheels trying to explain it away. It's like anything else. Somebody starts repeating something, and then if you repeat it, you're just adding on to the fire.
Yeah, that's what I talked about in the very beginning of this class. Is most people hold to these simplistic platitudes in their life. They repeat simple statements as a measure of trying to have a simple understanding of the world around them. But so the idea of like this, this is something we'll cover in a much later class. It reveals something central that's affecting the church right now. Probably the most dangerous thing happening in the church right now. As I keep telling you, this new atheism thing is already kind of dead. We're dealing with it now that it's become the air we breathe in the culture these days, but now it's been replaced by something far more insidious. So yeah, we'll cover that later. But yeah, it's something else. And if you think that some of the philosophical stuff was difficult to wrap your head around with, wait till you get into this class. You're gonna be like, I don't get it.
It's to me, you shouldn't even consider it. You didn't consider it.
But you have to in order to push back against it.
Well, what push back?
What?
Why push back? Let them go. I mean,
because it's already in the church.
Yeah,
it's in this church.
That's a problem because
It's
the
such
church.
aggressive Christianity,
Yes.
where social justice has.
Yeah, and I'm gonna try to reel this back in, but we're gonna cover this down the road.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is something pressing. But right now, we're maintaining the resurrection account. Yeah.
May I ask you a question real quick, and it deals with this, but is it something we're going to cover later about the prophecies about Jesus? Is that what we get into that later, or because I'm kind of curious why you didn't include it with the historical evidence?
Time frame, but it's also going to be we're doing apologetical accounts. Internal biblical sources are typically discounted as being accurate, and the idea of prophecy is something that basically somebody who's already a believer is going. It's going to help bolster their faith, but somebody who's an anti-theist is going to just be like whatever, You're basically telling fairy stories at this point in time. But yeah, is it evidence? Of course, yeah. But for an internal dialogue with a Christian that might be struggling with their faith, then yes, that is very important.
Well, I mean, what was her name? Baba, a famous somewhere. You could look up Baba and it'll bring it up. But people put a lot of, a lot of people, maybe not an atheist, but people who are spiritual put a lot of stock in prophecy. Look how they look at people like Nostradamus or that clairvoyant wacko at the beginning of the 20th century, who would sit on a couch playing the sleeping prophet, where he'd sleep and he'd tell people about the future.
Not familiar with him.
You look up sleeping prophet, I get his name, but anyways, the guy was like, he was a lot like Amy Semple McPherson or even a Catherine Coleman, except he was the sleeping prophet, supposedly a Christian. And anyways, if I would have said the guy's name back in 1920, like everybody in America would know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's how popular he was. He wasn't really a celebrity, but everybody knew who he was, just like everybody knows who Nostradamus is.
Yeah.
So, but they put a lot of stock in those. Every single time a world event happens, you see people putting up the quatrains.
Yeah. Is this something like along the lines of like a New Age spirituality?
Sure.
Yeah.
But that would be like, where it won't reach a skeptic because they don't believe in anything.
Well, I want to push back a little bit when you're dealing with people with like kind of a New Age spirituality, some of it, especially with the new to modern movement, as the guy I'm looking at. They are very adept at syncretizing other beliefs and taking you in. So people who have these they're actually hermetic beliefs, you have to dismantle their belief system first. Otherwise, they're going to say, "Oh yeah, we'll take that prophecy. We're still going to believe in our New Age thought, but we're going to adopt your Christian prophecy under the umbrella of what we believe." So yeah.
So should we steer away from prophecy then?
No, it has its right applications. The primary application.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
Well, just know your audience or know who you're.
Yeah. It's mainly going to be an internal apologetic for like new Christians, new believers who are trying to get the coherency of the Bible together. Yeah. Then prophecy is key. External atheists aren't going to take credence to it. Then obviously New Age spiritualists will probably just take it and like absorb it into their overarching worldview. But yeah.
Well, proof that Jesus wasn't enlightened one, in other words.
Exactly. Yeah. Because think of Manichaeism, that they thought of Jesus as another line of prophets, just as Mormonism or Islam. So they have the prophets available to them too, but they come to whole.
Oh, got it. So kind of like if you were to go to a Mormon and be like, "Hey, Isaiah talks about Jesus," they'd be like, "Yeah, sure he does. Man, this is great evidence of Christ."
Yeah.
Here, let me show you.
Yeah, and then you want to basically like specialize on your apologetic argument towards Mormons at that point in time. So. But yeah, it does have its application. But right now we're dealing with external accounts of the resurrection. So sorry if we got a little bit down in the weeds there, but this is a very good question to ask us. Yeah, I know y'all are going to be asking like, what is our biblical evidence? And for us, I'm going to state that again. For us Christians, the Bible is our most revered piece of evidence. It is infallible, but the people who we're going to be attending to, they're going to just discount it. And, so I'm trying to switch gears from when apologetics is necessary or when evangelical techniques are necessary. That's one of the things I talk to Farrell about a lot, is you have to know which one. So when you're going to be quoting Bible verse, you're going to be doing something more evangelical. When you're going to be talking argumentation, like history or anything like that, you're going to be going apologetics. So it kind of seems like it's weird, like why can't I use the Bible verse? There's nothing I'm saying you can't. It just has its time and its place. And a lot of people, and I'm not saying that don't ever use the Bible or don't ever be afraid of bringing up the Bible to non-believers, but know if you're going to do a biblical reference that may how that may be received by your audience. And that's all. Are you trying to? I don't know how to best put it. It's just I think we've talked about it enough in previous classes about people whose hearts are so hardened to the Bible that they're going to discount it. Which, if the Holy Spirit leading you to say, "Hey, this person's hard of heart," then just walk away. Dust off your dust off your feet and walk away. But if you have a very receptive audience, then you pray for guidance mostly. But
we had it was Brother Jerry Scott that was at Uvalde, left I think in 2012, but he always told people that I will talk to you. We'll have a discussion after you've read the chapter of John 3 times.
That's
He
interesting. Yeah.
said, you read it 3 times, and then we'll talk.
Yeah, that's going to have that requires a bit of commitment. So yeah, that's going to come with a lot of trust. But once you've got somebody who's willing to do that,
Said, we'll have this discussion. I'll have a
Yeah.
discussion with you, but you gotta read it so that we can discuss it. If
Yeah.
you haven't read it, we don't have anything to discuss.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair enough. And then, but you're also going to have different type of people. Some people are going to be they're going to come at you who are very knowledgeable about it, and they will be able to discount all your biblical evidence if you want to reference the prophecies. If you're wanting to speak of historical evidence within the Bible, that's why I'm somewhat hesitant, but also trying to say this is something we have to know your audience. But at this point where you've got this relationship with the person that they've already opened up with you, they respect you well enough, and then that's where you're going your audience. But yeah, that's a very good piece of advice, but that's not going to be something typically after your first encounter with somebody.
Right, you would have to build a relationship.
Exactly, but yeah, that's a wonderful technique. So I do like that, especially if somebody comes and critiques a specific part of the Bible, then you've got something to work with. So I wouldn't discount using internal biblical references to form the coherency of what they're trying to refute, but you also have to have some external sources to back it up. So yeah, to defend the Bible as being a coherent source, because like last week we were talking about pushing back against contradictions in the Bible and everything else. Did everybody get that email with all the different videos and the paperwork and everything?
Oh, I might haven't checked my email in a while.
Okay, so. What? Oh.
You didn't add me to your list.
Can you write me your email down on the notepad or something again? So I'm sorry.
I texted to him.
Kendall, KENDELL, @jbwastewater.com.
Okay. I'm so sorry about that. I'll send you all the past emails right now. Okay, so now we're talking about the resurrection appearances. Next, there is an evidence that Jesus' disciples have real experiences with one whom they believe was the risen Christ. This is not commonly disputed today because we have the testimony of the original disciples themselves that they saw Jesus alive again. One doesn't need to believe in the reliability of the Gospels to believe in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8. Paul records an ancient creed concerning Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection appearances that is much earlier than the letter in which Paul is recording it. So that was the referencing as being written in 54 AD. And this is actually the earliest Christian creed, predates the Apostles' Creed, which is a wonderful piece of evidence we have, and also for something we can state as a baseline of what we believe in as Christians. And this is
That's the what now?
the earliest creed that we have as Christians as to say what we have to believe in. So we have all these different creeds, like the Nicene Creed, the Chalcedonian Creed. We have later, say if you want to go with the Westminster Confession, things of that nature, where you're able to have an earlier catechesis of what we believe as Christians, or you have what's called the Didache, which is a very early document, which was written within the lifespan of John, yeah. That gives a really good account of what we believe in as Christians. So this is within the lifespan of many of the apostles' words written, "For I delivered to you as of the first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, and last to me, the least of the apostles." So, now it is generally agreed by scholars that Paul received this creed from Peter and James between 3 to 5 years after the crucifixion. We recognize that just because of the disciples think they saw Jesus doesn't automatically mean that they really did. There are 3 possible alternatives. 1, they were lying. 2, they hallucinated. Or 3, they really saw the risen Christ. So, countering objection 1, they were lying. People will often die for a lie that they believe is the truth. But if Jesus did not rise, the disciples knew it. Thus, they wouldn't have just been dying for a lie that they mistakenly believed was true. They would have been dying for a lie that they knew was a lie. 10 people would not all give their lives for something they knew to be a lie. I think we discovered that pretty clearly and humorously in that previous video, but we don't really have any historical evidences of people dying for a lie. People across history have died for causes that they believe in, but nobody. I guess maybe somebody who would go down with their ship in their own lie. I can't see that happening. Go ahead.
Was it, they have Fox's Book of Martyrs, and Fox was, he was alive, that was 2nd century, he was alive, right?
Not
Where
certain.
he was it 3rd?
I'm not certain.
I would think it was 2nd century, I'd have to go back and look at it. But, there's only 3 deaths that we can actually prove through outside sources, right? And that'd be Paul, James, and Peter.
Yes. And the rest are more or less church tradition, yeah.
Yeah, church tradition. I mean, other than Fox's Book of Martyrs in the Bible, or what we read about in the Bible, we really don't know.
Exactly, but yeah.
Where James was thrown from the temple, and that was proven to be true.
Yeah.
I think that's even Josephus who records that. But and then Paul, that's Rome.
Yeah, so we're talking about like we have like first person testimonial account, and we have,
and John.
Yeah.
John, and that one can be proven, but
Yes.
he wasn't martyred. He was sent to the island to work on as a slave labor.
Yeah.
Over the Isle of Patmos.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, it just depends on where you want to call, how you want to determine the evidence. So can church tradition be called evidence? So we have tradition of the early church fathers that we build most of our modern theology on. So I would say, yeah, it's very.
So you would say that because the people that were alive during the time period that other eyewitnesses would have witnessed this.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, Polycarp would have witnessed. Polycarp would have witnessed, or at least heard about him while he was still alive, or as a younger man.
Yeah.
Would have at least heard about from eyewitnesses, people who saw that, so we could use Polycarp as a historical
piece of evidence. Yes. Yeah. They're trying to look for in modern forensic.
I guess, or even Ignatius or
Ignatius. Yeah. Some modern forensic historical proofs are based on how they can corroborate one piece of historical evidence against another piece. So if there's like one piece, it's considered evidence, but they don't consider it a method of corroboration, or if they have 2 pieces that aren't quite matching. So that's all that it is. Yeah, we do have these traditions. You can go to a church, the church in India that's based at Thomas's grave, and his body's supposed to be buried under the altar there, and they still uphold the tradition firmly. It's passed down through the generations, but the people say that's actual historical proof. Well, this depends on what you're looking at for historical proof. If it's going to be something that's on the high scholarly level, or it's going to be something that.
Well, I'm just saying, because I'm sure that, because I've actually heard debates where they're like, hey, we can't, because they'll bring up that fact where it states, hey, 10 guys wouldn't give their life for a lie. Mm-hmm. And they go, well, it can only be proven that 3 of them actually gave their lives.
Yeah, so then they can think if those, that makes, we're talking about the least.
But it's not, but that wouldn't be a true statement that only 3. We could actually state that 10, or actually 11, because of Paul. And then, of course, if you were to include guys like Mark and Luke and some of the others, then that would be, it would be numerous. But those would be people that were alive during the people who eyewitnessed Jesus' persecution and the persecution of the apostles.
Exactly. So you want to limit it to the apostles alone, or to the other, say, disciples or people.
Well, they were considered apostles. They were the lowercase a. The apostles and the apostles.
Without getting into semantics, but that's the kind of, you're getting into like the scholarly level debate that goes on. And it just depends on what you define as evidence, and the least.
Well, I guess
the more you can narrow down an argument to what they're trying to do is get down to the 3 historically confirmed under scholarly parlance. People, then you have a much easier time trying to dismantle the arguments. But then there's a ton of stuff written on, a lot of material written on historicity, and there's a lot of it falls back and forth. And even atheist biblical scholars, which are actually people who do that. Biggest one. they support a lot of historicity, even of the church tradition, just from their scholarship within the Greek text at that time frame.
So it wouldn't be, like, we wouldn't be using something that could corroborate if we said the remaining 10 disciples
Yeah, it just
gave their lives.
it's harder
for
to
something they believed in.
it's just harder to defend historically, but we as Christians we can hold to church tradition. It's just you're looking at the quality of pushback you're going to get back from your whoever you're working with. So this is a good thing to dig in deeper to this material, which we can. I'm basically.
I'm sorry, I'm not
no. You're actually pointing out something we need to be cognizant of as apologists. We can't just have a surface level knowledge of this material. You have to dig deep. So what I'm teaching you here today should serve as just basically a primer for basically a lifelong mission of studying the material, so you can counter all the counter arguments, because there are many. And a lot of this stuff I'm showing you all, on its face, it seems like it's rock solid evidence, but there is a slew of debate and back and forth on all this material that if you want to become familiar with, I greatly welcome. I can also help you all in further classes, but none of these are for everybody a grand slam apologetic argument, but they are, once again, another tool in our kit. So yeah, Farrell brings up something very big. If you're going to get into more your academic field of people who are academically inclined, you're going to have to dig deep on this stuff. But the common person off the street that you're going to be dealing with, this should be sufficient, but be prepared. You may receive pushback from those who know the material. So yeah, this is a very good point you're bringing up. So moving on, so objection 2, that they hallucinated. The hallucination theory is untenable because it cannot explain the physical nature of the appearances. The disciples report eating and drinking with Jesus as well as touching him. This cannot be done with hallucinations. Second, it is highly unlikely that we all have the same hallucination. Hallucinations are highly individual and not group projections. So it's not like they were all drinking the funny Kool-Aid.
Isn't there an actual theory out there where it is a mass hallucination theory?
Yes, there is, yeah. So there's been cases of, I think with the earliest exposure to people to LSD was in bread mold in medieval Europe, and something like that could have been in the bread and served at the Last Supper, and all the disciples were tripping from there on in.
Well, the only reason I bring this up, and forgive me, I'm not trying to ask all these questions, it's just, they come to mind, they seem like legitimate questions that I should be asking. The reason I bring that up is because you also have, like that happened in, I think it was Brazil back in the 30s, where those 3 girls saw Jesus, or saw Mary.
Okay.
Fatima, something or another.
So that would have been Portugal.
Oh, Portugal, I'm sorry, so Fatima. Oh yeah, the Brazilians hate the Portuguese, don't they? That's my bad. So the Portugal, but anyways, so knowing, okay, so I wouldn't put credence in what the 3 little girls saw.
Well,
so therefore, could I put credence in what the disciples?
That's an interesting thing, because whatever evidence you have against those 3 girls actually pushes back against the evidence.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
So we're talking about hallucinations specifically here. So there's been a lot of research done on hallucinogenics, and one of the things they've discovered is that no 2 people have the same hallucination. Everybody's having their own unique little trip. So, but we're talking about a mass hallucination. There's no recorded evidence of anything of the type. So you can have all of us in this room we could be all hallucinating, but we're not going to see the same thing. So when it starts becoming curious, once you start having multiple people having a matching account, so then you have to. So for you, if you don't believe in the accounts of the girls who saw Mary or Fatima, I don't remember the exact account, but then there's pushback against other things. But yeah, if you're going to push back saying it's a hallucination, then this comes back. So we don't want to step on philosophical rakes when we're trying to make arguments. So
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, because I can see someone saying, "Oh, well, to refute this," they would say, "Well, do you believe in this that happened in Portugal?" And then I would, if I'm being honest, I would have to say, "Well, no." And then they go, "Okay, well."
yeah, then you have to be able to make an account for why you don't believe, or you can see that argument coming and be able to try to make a counter argument. Yeah, and that's the thing, is I'm going to teach you down the line is the art of argumentation, how not to be constantly on the defense and be pushing back, because the most difficult thing is to constantly have to answer the skeptic's questions, but what you want is them answering your questions. So, yeah, so in a term like that, that could be considered, that's pretty much a red herring. They're trying to get you off the track in some ways. A red herring argument is always something like, but what about this? But you can use that if you have the know-how to be able to come back in and bolster your argument. But that's like another, like one of those chess moves that we have to figure out.
Red herring, kind of like the Gabriel tablet,
Huh?
things like that, like the Gabriel tablet.
I'm not on that.
We'll talk about it.
Okay, yeah.
It goes, okay, that makes sense, a red herring.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the third premise is they really saw the risen Christ. Since the disciples could not have been lying or hallucinating, we have only one possible explanation left. The disciples believed that they had seen the risen Jesus because they really had seen the risen Jesus. So the resurrection appearances alone demonstrate the resurrection. Thus, if we reject the resurrection, we are left with a second inexplicable mystery. First, the empty tomb, and now the appearances. Okay, so I'm going to get you into arguments against the resurrection, and this is even a weirder one. It's called the swoon theory. The premise is that Jesus did not actually die, but he went into a deep coma, or swoon, from the severe pain and trauma of the crucifixion. However, in the cool atmosphere of the tomb, he revived and was somehow able to get out of the strips of cloth wrapped tightly around his body and appear to his disciples. And the rebuttal to this is, remember, the Roman guards were actually the first to report Jesus' death in John 19:33-37. They were experts at execution and would be put to death themselves if they were allowed to condemn man to escape death. They were so certain that Jesus was dead, they did not even bother to break his legs. And when the spear they thrust into Jesus' side brought forth blood and water, they had final proof of his death, for this occurs when the heart stops beating. And also, for the swoon theory to be valid, Jesus would have to have survived the massive loss of blood through the scourging, the nail wounds, and the spear thrust. In addition, in this impossibly weakened condition, he would have had to endure 40 hours without food or drink, manage to unwrap himself from his grave clothes, and roll away the massive stone closing the tomb, and then convince his followers that he'd risen from the dead. So we're starting to see like the more complicated backstories when you're trying to come up with these objections. He would have had to travel countless miles in that condition to make many appearances to his disciples over a period of 40 days. He would have had to delude the disciples into thinking that he could simply appear in a room without the use of a door. This theory is so absurd, it really doesn't deserve to be dignified with the response, but there are some who would conveniently hang their doubt on it. Okay, so then the second is the no burial theory. Jesus says that Jesus was never put in the tomb. Instead, he was thrown into a mass grave for criminals, according to Roman custom. And the rebuttal for this is, if this were true, neither the Jewish leaders nor the Roman soldiers would have bothered to seal the tomb, knowing his body was not in there. And we have Matthew 27:62-66 to be able to back that up. So moreover, to disprove Jesus' resurrection, they would only have to retrieve the body and put it on display. Okay, then we covered this earlier, but the mass hallucination theory. Everyone who claimed to see the risen Lord was hallucinating out of an earnest desire to see Jesus alive again. Rebuttal, Jesus' disciples had not expected to see him alive again. It came as a complete and total shock to them. Scripture also tells us that 500 people saw him on one occasion alone. So here we have we're talking about a little bit of internal evidence versus external evidence. So I'm trying to cover a little bit of internal and external. So I'm sorry I didn't put the prophecies in this account. There's also my first iteration of this. It was like somewhere 93 slides, and I started having to cut So go back to the mass hallucination theory. Ironically, the non-believers initially had more faith in the words of Jesus than his own disciples. The chief priests and Pharisees came to see Pilate and said, "Sir, remember while he was still alive, how that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore, command that the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal them away, and say to the people, 'He has risen from the dead.' So the last deception will be worse than the first." This is what I talked about earlier, where they came to Pilate for an objective guard. They remembered Jesus' words concerning the resurrection, while the disciples had apparently forgotten them. So the idea that you still had the Roman and Jewish authorities remembering these words while that the apostles had forgotten about this kind of makes it self-refuting, to say the least. So then there's the stolen body theory. So this states that Jesus' disciples took his body in order to fulfill Jesus' prophecy that he would die and be resurrected. So according to Scripture, the story goes back to the day the guards had stood watch at Jesus' tomb. Who told the chief priests what had transpired? The chief priests bribed the guards, telling them to spread the story instead of what they had witnessed, and this we do have in the Bible. But we can rebut this by saying Jesus' friends could not have taken his body because they would have left the scene convinced that he was dead. When the women reported Jesus' resurrection to the 11 apostles and other believers in Jerusalem, their words seemed like idle tales, and they did not believe them, as accounted for in Luke 24:11. The apostles had no reason to counterfeit Jesus' resurrections, since they did not even believe it themselves. How could it be that the very man who fled for their lives while Jesus was still alive could suddenly muster the courage and ingenuity to steal the body from a guarded tomb, and then boldly start preaching and teaching about the Jesus they knew was dead? Okay, so now we're going to get into, we're actually going through these slides really quick, which is awesome. So,
When Mary,
what's that?
James or Jude dressed up like Jesus.
Yeah, there's a bevy, as I said, especially with social media, especially with TikTok these days. There's a proliferation of crazy conspiracy theories being put out almost every day. So you got to kind of be prepared for it. I wouldn't recommend anybody get on TikTok, but there's enough material where Christian apologists are reading on TikTok to refute all these crazy ideas that are coming up. But yeah, if you think this sounds crazy, this is only the very tip of the iceberg. These are the more reasonable objections we have, to say the least. So we're going to talk about the commitment of the apostles. So this is a very strong piece of evidence we're all talking about. That obviously we covered in that comedic video at first, like the idea that the apostles would go on their gruesome deaths through persecution to hold up a lie. But the interesting thing is the apostles were in a unique position. They knew if the claims about Jesus were true. They knew that the accounts about Jesus. Not reading well tonight. They were present for the life, ministry, death, and alleged resurrection of Jesus. If the claims about Jesus were a lie, the disciples would have known it. In fact, they would have been the source of the lie. That's why their commitment to their testimony was and is so compelling. Unlike the rest of us, their willingness to die for their claims is tremendous evidence of value. In fact, the commitment of the apostles confirms the truth of the resurrection. And this is where we're going to be talking about all their deaths here. So, and as Pharaoh pointed out, yeah, we only have absolute evidence for Peter, Paul, and John, but we do have a very good tradition within the church to account for the rest. So the traditions related to the deaths of the apostles are well known. According to local and regional histories, all of the disciples died for their claims related to the resurrection. Peter, in Rome, Peter was severely scourged and then crucified. He asked to be crucified upside down, not upright like Jesus. Andrew, brother of Peter, Andrew was martyred in Achaia, that's the Roman province of Greece. It was there that he was bound to an X-shaped cross and crucified. He preached to his persecutors until he died. James, son of Zebedee, James was the first of the apostles to be martyred. His death is the only martyrdom of the apostles mentioned in the New Testament. Herod Agrippa I, the grandson of Herod the Great, was responsible for beheading James. John, brother of James, he was banished to Patmos, a prison colony off the coast of modern-day Turkey. Though John was sentenced to death there because of his faith, he was the only apostle who did not die for his belief in the risen Christ. God kept him alive for a reason, as we know, and being able to be there to receive the book of Revelations. Philip, this apostle, was martyred in Heliopolis. He was scourged and later crucified. Bartholomew, otherwise known as Nathaniel, according to the martyrdom of St. Bartholomew, he was put in a sack and thrown into the sea. Another tradition states he was crucified upside down after being flayed alive. And flayed means having your skin removed. Thomas, this apostle of Christ, was run through the body with a lance in India. Matthew was slain in Ethiopia. In fact, the Ethiopian church still holds that he is buried in one of their main churches. James, son of Alphaeus, the apostle James, was stoned and was then beaten to death with a club. Judas, son of James, or Thaddeus. Church tradition is not clear on the martyrdom of this apostle. One tradition states he was crucified, while another tradition claims he was shot to death with arrows. And Simon the Zealot, tradition states Simon was crucified in Britain after preaching the gospel there. So, well, we don't have, as stated there, we don't have irrefutable evidence for most of the apostles. What we do know is that they all did go on and preach the gospel throughout the world as they were commanded. And there are some fairly strong traditions within church traditions of these disciples being there. So the Ethiopian church still venerates Matthew for bringing the gospel down to Ethiopia. And I don't know much of, in fact, when I found out this information, I really want to dig into Simon the Zealot in Britain, because you have to dig into pre-Anglo-Saxon British material to find that. It's very scarce. So I really want to look into that now. So we can be confident these men died for their claims. There were two quick ways to end the upstart Christian religion in the first century, and both the Jewish and Roman leadership would have been eager to accomplish this task. First, the enemies of Christianity would simply have dragged the body of Jesus through the town to demonstrate he was still dead. Second, they could have forced the alleged eyewitnesses to recant. Neither of these two things ever occurred. And also, in that day and age, it would have been common for them to dismember the bodies and put the head, arms, and legs up on display at certain points around cities to warn anybody of any future rebellion. So you may not be aware, but we do have ancient accounts of recanting on part of Christians. Pliny the Younger was a Roman lawyer and magistrate who lived from 61 to 113 AD. He served as the governor of Bithynia, Pontus, now located in modern Turkey, under Emperor Trajan. And he conducted trials against those who had been identified as Christians. In a letter he wrote to Trajan in 111 to 113 AD, he said the following, and this is important when we get to this, because the idea of comparing the accounts of people, like say, actually recanting their beliefs against those who will actually die for their beliefs. So in the case of those who denounced to me as Christians, I have observed the following procedure. I interrogated these, asked whether they were Christians. Those who confessed, I interrogated a second and third time, threatening them with punishment. Those who persisted, I ordered executed, for I had no doubt that whatever the nature of their creed, stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy surely deserved to be punished. Those who denied that they were or had been Christians when they evoked the gods in words dictated by me, offered prayer with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought for this purpose, together with the statues of the gods, and moreover cursed Christ. None of which those who are really Christians, it is said, can be forced to do. These, I thought, should be discharged. So we have Romans talking about, they're like, the real Christians are dying. So others named by the informer declared that they were Christians, but then denied it, asserting that they had been, but had ceased to be. Some 3 years before, others many years, some as many as 25 years. They all worshipped your image and the statues of the gods and cursed Christ. So not every early Christian was willing to die for his or her beliefs. Here we have excellent evidence of second generation Christians recanting their claims to stay alive in the Roman Empire. One thing is certain, the Roman authorities recognized the importance of their efforts to obtain denials from early Christians. Plenty's work in this regard, recorded very early in history, or evidence of this. In fact, there's other evidence I didn't really, like one of the things I cut, but there's also a lot of writing within the early church fathers into how to handle the people who actually denied Christ. Would they let them back into church after they repented? There was huge amounts of debates going on in the very early church on that, because how would we handle that if we were under persecution for our faith in this day and age where we knew a large amount of our brothers and sisters were executed for not recanting their beliefs, while we had others who we saw with our very eyes had burned incense to the Caesar. So many second generation Christians who were not eyewitnesses of the resurrection recanted their membership in the Christian family to stay alive, yet there isn't a single ancient document, letter, or piece of evidence indicating any of the Christian eyewitnesses, the apostolic disciples, as we were talking about earlier, ever changed their story or surrendered their claims. Given the reasonable expectation of this Roman effort and the evidence from history confirming the trials of Christians, it's remarkable none of the eyewitnesses ever changed their claims. So our willingness as non-witnesses later in history to die for what we believe has no evidential value, but the willingness of the first disciples to die for what they saw with their own eyes is a critical piece of evidence in the case of Christianity. And early tradition of the church related to these deaths is bolstered by the lack of any ancient record of apostolic denial, especially given that there exist other ancient accounts of public persecutions and denials by early Christians. The commitment of the disciples to their claims is compelling. Unlike the rest of us, their willingness to die for what they witnessed has tremendous evidential value. The commitment of the apostles confirms the truth of the resurrection. And this is where I got out of this. This is the gentleman who was the forensic cold case detective. It's out of his book. Very good book. I really recommend you all reading it. Okay, wow, we're actually cutting through these slides really quickly. Okay, so anybody have any questions about evidence for the resurrection at this point?
I do have a question.
Okay.
So, when thinking about your audience and saying most of the time the person on the street wants to have a conversation with you, the Bible's already doesn't matter to them.
It depends.
It depends. But then we go back and then went back and said that the account of the apostles count as evidence as well, which is the gospel. So does it not count, or does it count? Like how?
Yeah. So yeah, I see what you're saying, and that's a very good question. So yeah, that's why I'm putting up so many non-biblical sources here. Non-believers will be more apt to believe non-biblical sources. So we were quoting from Pliny the Younger. We can also quote from Josephus, who's a Jewish, first century Jewish historian, wrote on the
Commissioned by Rome.
What's that? Yeah, he was very much, exactly. He was paid for, commissioned by Rome to write a history of the Jewish wars. Yeah, it was he actually participated in the Jewish rebellion at the time, surrendered to Rome, and part of his surrender agreement was to write an unbiased history of that time frame. And he does bring up Jesus and his following in the time frame. And there are a number of different other ancient historians who do cover the account, but they're more along the lines of there are people here who call themselves Christians, who follow the way, and so they're more evidence of early Christianity than they are of the resurrection.
So I guess my question is if this would be internal, because this is not commonly disputed today, because we have a testimony of the original disciples themselves that saw Jesus alive again. But if that testimony is in the gospel, is in the Bible, that's just not something you would use.
Depends.
Like, how do you, you wouldn't use that when talking to someone who doesn't believe it.
I would probably lead in with an analogy and use type of argument. So the typical claim you're going to get back is that all the years of evidence we have in the Bible is going to be like one long game of telephone. So you're going to have to give an analogy on how you're able to get a valid picture of an event through countering testimonies. Because and you push back even as hard as we can get, that no matter what we have from any historical account, all we have is testimony. Unless you were actually there, eyewitness to the event, we have only a certain amount of testimony. So you have to push back against their idea of what testimony is, or you can come in and like, okay, this is how historians generally give true claims to historical evidence, and that's by corroborating stories from various accounts. So a lot of the times you're going to want to have accounts of one group and an opposing group to get the most clear story. So like, I think I talked about in the third class about the battle of the name the battle between the Hittites and the Egyptians in no, it was the Harkish. Okay, I think it was Harkish.
It was in Syria, I think.
Yes. So well before. Go ahead. Yeah. So well before historians were even wanting to say there were actually people called the Hittites, there was the biblical and Egyptian accounts of fighting in this area. But then they later discovered the Hittite Empire, got the different accounts, and were able to corroborate from different opposing points of view. Because if you look at histories in those days, they were typically, as I said, blown out. We conquered so many people, we killed them, we slew them, we destroyed their land until there were no more. And they sounded very crazy claims that typically was typical of the day. But when you were able to get the corroborating piece of evidence from the other side, typically saying the Hittites were saying the same thing, we slew all the Egyptians, we destroyed all their lands, and then you were able to take and corroborate those two pieces of evidence, find the commonalities between the two, especially the parts where they're most conflicting, and then you're able to develop a picture. So we have that against, let's see here, what would be a good piece of evidence in the time frame? If we were to corroborate evidence, like say the Napoleonic Wars from the evidence we get out of the French archives and then what we get out of the British archives, you're obviously going to get different accounts, but you're able to take the two stories and find out by comparing them, and then also with other pieces of evidence you can have in your hand, like say physical evidence or whatever you have, and then you're able to develop a bigger picture, and that's what we're trying to do here. So sometimes all we have to do is we have to work with is biblical evidence, but we also have certain argumentations and tools we can use to be able to support the biblical evidence. So, yeah, that's a very good question. But yeah, am I going to say that you can't use biblical text? No. But am I going to say don't believe with them? No. With the caveat, no, you're honest. But be able to back up the claims. And I think that would be a better clarification to answer your question. Does that help?
It does help. And just to add one more, I guess what I really didn't understand was one doesn't need to believe in the reliability of the gospel to believe in
the historicity.
Gotcha.
Yeah. If you can get them to believe the historical evidence, then you're one step further and be able to present a case for theological evidence. So.
This maybe covers what I've walked out, but is it fair to just go ahead and with an open-ended question just say, well, where are you getting your information?
Yeah, that's where you always want to put that.
Tell me
You always
where
want to know where
you're
they're
getting
getting
your
the sources.
information.
Yeah.
Well, see, you have to understand something, man.
Please.
It's upon them to prove the disposition.
Absolutely.
If they disagree with, for instance, if you're out speaking the gospel and someone chimes up, you're a liar, you're wrong. Fine, then prove your argument. I've made
What
a
have I
claim.
stated that's not true?
Exactly.
Or where are you getting, because more than likely, a lot of people are just going to go, so-and-so said, I saw it on TV.
It's upon them to prove the disparity.
And more than likely they can't.
Yeah.
Unless they are
Exactly.
academic.
Exactly. And it's not that hard to push back, and that's where, especially when you're dealing with people who are getting their evidence from unreliable sources.
You know, I heard from a TikTok video.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to.
No, please, yeah.
Yeah.
We're actually we're making really good progress today, so I really.
All right, so I would say, I would say like, you make the claim Jesus rose from the dead, and you're speaking with somebody on the street, right? And then you'll always have those people that want to chime in. Somebody's passing by, here's what you're stating, and they go, "That's a myth. You know, that's not true." And then you stop. Well, pardon me, sir or ma'am. Where
Where are you getting that?
are you getting your information? May I ask what you believe? What is your belief system? You know, it's upon them to prove the disparity. You're making a truth claim, and you can back it up with facts because you're not going to go into a conversation with somebody with no information.
Yeah. Well, also, I had this conversation with you on Sunday, but you have to be careful with backing up solely with facts, because every fact you present is an opportunity for a counterclaim. So a lot of times you want to back up with another argument, you want to counter with another argument, and you want to.
I'm horrible at that.
Yeah, work with the most defensible facts you have.
And then to me, then you could pick out something that you're like, oh, well, I find that very interesting.
Yes.
Let's visit about this.
Exactly.
And, but again, like you said, don't be back to the corner.
Yeah, because the idea that apologetics is just purely defensive, I think it gives everybody a really bad idea as to how we're going to be engaged with this around the world. And then how we see apologetics done online gives us this idea that we're just going to be doing these mic drop arguments and everybody's going to take them at face value. So yeah, it's going to take a bit of skill and knowledge of especially who you're working with, and also of all the Bible and all the claims we're defending.
What is it, Frank Turco says there's two questions to ask. One is like, I forget what the first question is, but how did you come to that conclusion? But
Define your terms. How did you define your terms? How did you come to the conclusion?
something
Yeah.
along
Yeah, that's just basically we're talking here. When you brought up that earlier, and you're building the second part, is all the Socratic method.
Right.
So, yeah, anytime somebody pushes back against you, your automatic response is to want to defend the premise, but realize that they're coming in with a set of assumptions. So, if I say to you, like, the sky is blue, it sounds kind of silly. It's like, define what you mean by blue. Does that mean it's kind of it's obvious, but a lot of people will be coming with like a different conception or a different idea. I don't think that's probably a bad example. Yeah, but you get the idea. Is in essence, a lot of people come in with the conception like, say the Bible was a lie. Okay, no, that's not a good one. I don't know why I'm having a bad time coming up with hypothetical arguments right now, but I can just give you general.
The Bible was written by men, therefore it must be.
Oh yeah, okay. So then you push back on that. So is everything then written by men?
Yeah. Well, do you believe your license? Is your license true?
What?
Is your birth certificate true?
Yeah, exactly. So
You know, those were written by men. You have no problem.
yeah, well, we don't have to define terms and explanation in there, but yeah, we'll be able to get to that at some other point. But yeah, and this is something I'm going to be trying to teach you all on the applied part of the course, is how to engage, and that's where it takes a lot of patience too. People are going to be coming at you a lot of times, especially when people are proven wrong. A lot of people can handle it fairly humbly, but not a lot of people do, especially when it comes to something that's very deeply held belief, especially something that let's say people harbor a bit of anger and resentment towards. Yeah, we have to be really prepared for that. Okay, so I didn't really think we were going to get it this far this quick, so I remember I told you this was like 93 slides. I'm down to 71 here, so I wanted to get into more expansion rather than just the resurrection claim, because so we have a dude that resurrects. So we have in the Bible, we got Lazarus was brought back from the dead. We've got I can't remember the name of the gentleman who touched Elijah's bones, who was raised from the dead. So we've got a number of different Elijah rose.
Raised two people.
Yeah.
There was a sick girl on the board.
Yeah, exactly. The widow's son, and I can't remember who else. So we do have a lot of different resurrection accounts in the Bible, but we also.
And I'm convinced there's a clay pot somewhere that has an oil rig on top of it, lumping oil from a pot that just can't
Can't stop.
Can't stop building the oil.
Cookie
Yeah.
But
Still, I mean, they can refine that. I mean, I'm serious. There's got to be somewhere.
you don't think God was gonna put the nozzle back into the pump there?
Oh yeah, I don't know, man. All I know is that there's a clay pot somewhere that's got oil. That is just there's got to be a cavity in the earth somewhere that's filling up with oil from this pot.
Yeah,
If it was tipped over, it would just fossilized right here.
It's the Bertolli's factor.
Yeah, right. That's where it is. I'm like, we had this. We're still in the same. I'm just convinced. I don't know what.
Alright, so the important part of the resurrection is obviously we're talking about the fulfilled prophecy. Obviously, Jesus was the incarnate second person of the Trinity. And at what point in time, so if Jesus is resurrected, okay, so we got a dude who came back to life. Okay, whoop-de-doo. So now, not whoop-de-doo, deeply held belief, but you're going to get some pushback this way. So now, you have to bolster the idea that you have the resurrected incarnate God. That's a little harder to it.
Can you use the instances in the Bible where it's recorded where God spoke and was saying, "This is my son"? Because right here it's like, where did Jesus claim to be God?
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean, it was God that claimed that Jesus was God because he says, "This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased."
Yeah.
And he made that claim twice, and then another time. So, anyways, there's two recorded instances in the Gospels where that the resurrection, or excuse me, the baptism, and then another time just before his crucifixion where there were witnesses. There was a group of people, and they said, "Wow, this," because it sounded like thunder. Where he says once again, "This is my son, in whom I'm well pleased."
Yeah.
And he did that to prove. It even states it in the Bible where he says, this was stated so that the people that were there would believe that this was Christ.
Yeah. Can you use it? Most definitely, yeah. So it's going to be, how are you going to apply it, though, is the most important thing. So a lot of times we're going to have, so this is like a segue. So I didn't realize we were going to get to these slides so quickly. So this is going to be the segue. Okay, say you're long discussion with the person you're doing your apologetics with. You're able to get a convincing, okay, I agree with you with the historical account of the resurrection. This is true. So then how do you claim that this person who was resurrected was actually God? And not only that, we also have groups of people who call themselves Christians who do not believe in the divinity of Jesus, believe it or not. I'm not kidding you. You look at me like with this. Many,
What you're talking about, Will's face?
What?
What you're talking about, Will's
Yeah.
face?
What you talking about, Willis? Yeah. I make that same face too. Not as good as you, though. What I was going to say, yeah, there are certain Christian people, the modern progressives, don't believe in the divinity of Christ. There's Unitarian churches, they don't believe in the divinity of Christ.
This is what you were talking about when you said he emptied himself. When we were talking, where you said there's those who believe he emptied himself.
No, this is a total different view of Christology there. Not that he emptied himself.
I'm not trying to get you off the subject.
Yeah, there's certain portions of his divinity, yeah, but there's certain levels that you're going to run into. That's more the complicated side that you're going to run into, like say.
It cares back because I know Bethel teaches that.
Yeah, different churches, different theologians hold the different things. I had a long debate one time with another Christian who held into canonic Christology, but yeah, more to the point is there are going to be people even within Christian circles who don't hold to the divinity of God. Early Christian heresies did not hold into the divinity of God, or they had some very interesting views that Jesus was adopted, or he wasn't fully divine, or he wasn't fully human. He might have been a ghostly apparition, or you name it. So there's a number of different
Heresies out there.
heresies, crazy.
Well, you also have
conspiracy theories.
But you also have a lot of the church. I'm not trying to go off with I'm sorry.
Yeah, but you're talking about who this is going to be applied to. Yeah, but we're not going to be going back and then teaming up with Irenaeus and
against heresies. Yeah.
But we are. That's another thing as apologists.
I love that you knew where I was going with that. Right?
To be aware of heresies, because there are a number of different heresies throughout the history of the church, and they resurge over and over again under different names. And many of our apologetics is not going to be out and about. It's going to be kneeling early within the church about people saying, oh, I believe that Jesus was a good teacher, but I don't believe him being the Son of God or the divine incarnate logos, you name it. So, yeah. So that's going to be who we're going to be applying this to. Or the follow-up to, okay, I believe the resurrection is a historical event now. So, why is it so significant? And we want to follow up with, did Jesus claim to be God? And Jesus made this claim a number of times, and it's very clear to those he was talking to. Jesus didn't utter the 3 words, I am God, but he said it very explicitly in the context of his religion and culture, and you can see it in the reaction of his enemies. So monotheism was the central tenet of Judaism. They confessed the Shema from Deuteronomy, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. In Hebrew, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. There's only one God, and Jesus, as a good Jew, believed this. He also claimed to accurately teach the Old Testament. So when Jesus answered Philip that to see him was to see the Father, was a claim to deity. Philip said to him, Lord, show us the Father, and is it enough for show us the Father, and it is enough for us. Jesus said to him, have I been with you so long, and you still do not know me, Philip? Whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Do you not believe that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me? The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me does his works. Believe me that I am in the Father, and the Father is in me, or else believe on the account of the works themselves. Out of John 14. Some religions may make this claim without it being a claim to deity, but for a Torah-fulfilling Jew, he was telling Philip that he is God. John recounts Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees in John 8:58-59, where Jesus uses a very specific title that Jews understood was ascribed only to God. Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. We as Christians, we know that fairly well, that he's the great I am, and that he's also talking to being around prior to the Abrahamic covenant. So when Jesus uses the title, I am, the name of God uses for himself when answering to Moses in Exodus 3:14, the reaction of the Pharisees confirms this is precisely what Jesus was claiming because they tried to stone him for blasphemy. So if you want to know, I am in Hebrew is Ehyeh, but which is used, I am who I say I am is the term used, but then follows it by my name is the tetragrammaton, Yahweh, which is actually the verb to be in the infinitive form, which kind of means like I was, I am, and I am to come. So it's rather interesting in that account.
I am that I am. But wouldn't that also be like when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life? That would be another I am claim, correct?
It is an I am claim, yeah. But the way, the truth, and the life, yeah, that's to also talk about like the truth is going to be the appeal to the logos. The way is going to be, these are all different scriptural references. I'll have to look into that. When I speak into something, I'm going to trip all around there. But yeah, that's a good question to ask. So John tells us directly that Jesus was making himself equal with God. Since there was only one God, this was claiming to be God. In John 5, Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath, and Jewish leaders question Jesus about this violation of the law. Jesus claims authority over the Sabbath in the encounter. Then John tells us in 5:18, this is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his Father, making himself equal with God. They wanted to carry out the death penalty for this blasphemy. And in Mark 2, Jesus heals the paralytic man and forgives his sins. The scribes who were there called this blasphemy because only God has the authority to forgive sins. And this was the claim to be God. Luke records this claim also in Luke 5:20. So this goes back to what we were asking for. So we're basically at the point where internal, external evidence. Once we've gotten to the point where we can speak of the claims of deity deity of God, then we don't have any external account other than the account of the resurrection to work on, because once again, so would the apostles then lay their lives down knowing they're going to be running into extreme persecution, punishment, torture, and execution if this was just a good teacher resurrection? Or
No, several beatings, even when Peter in Acts the 2nd chapter, or and even into the 5th chapter, where he was getting beat, him and John were getting beat daily because they were preaching the gospel at the temple. And they even told that if they did it again, they'd kill him. So, I mean, serious beatings all the time. Paul was beat many times, even another time he had to claim that he was a Roman citizen just so they wouldn't beat Barnabas. Because they had started to beat Paul, being a Roman citizen. If you were to beat a Roman citizen, it was worthy of death.
yeah, and also sealed his fate, which he knew the only appeal he had was to Caesar at that time, which he knew was going to.
And then Caesar put him, of course, Nero, or was it Nero?
Yeah, it was
Nero.
I'm sorry, were you raising your hand?
Oh, no,
Okay.
but just, but if that, because Paul did that, then he was able to preach the gospel
In Rome.
in
Exactly.
Rome.
Yeah, so he, it's one of the most interesting things when we're reading through the book of Romans, where he's talking about how he so desires to see them, that he does eventually, but probably not in the terms he was hoping to, but nonetheless, it's still.
Yeah, because he was actually wanting to go to Spain.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, we're getting.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. I'm not talking about that. As I said, we're way ahead of where I thought we were going to be. So we're way past the testimony of the resurrection. So now we're talking about the historicity of the resurrection. Now we're talking about questions of the claims for the deity of Jesus. So in John 10, Jesus again claims to be one with the Father. The Jews question him, and he answers again elicit. His answers again elicit and attempt to stone him. Jesus asked them for which of his good works they want to kill him. They answer, "It is not for a good work that we are going to stone you, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself God." And they attempted to arrest him, but Jesus escaped. Okay. And this is another thing, so we're going to be talking about evidence that people are going to be claiming. Where did Jesus say, "I am God"? And that's going to be difficult to try to push back, even using a lot of the internal evidence. Like say, even with dealing with somebody who is somebody who says they're a Bible-believing Christian that may not believe in the deity of God, to be able to this is where we're able to use internal evidence within the Bible. But somebody who's, that's one of the things, I've had talks with somebody who does hold to these beliefs, and you can give them these internal evidences, and they're still like, I just want to see those 3 words, "I am God." Yes, sir.
Is it correct to state that a person who doesn't believe in the deity of Jesus is a Christian?
I would say no.
Yes,
So I wouldn't even refer to them as Christians. They're unbelievers. If they don't believe Jesus, to me, they're unbelievers.
Mm-hmm.
And the only reason apologetics applies here, we're trying to get them into the fold. Problem comes when they, at one time, confess Jesus, and then later they recant it. So then, it's kind of a fight with 2 swords for them. So, to me, Jesus is the total answer and the total question here. Because I think if anybody who denies or doesn't believe the deity of God is, obviously totally lost.
Yeah.
But if they're discussing the deity of Jesus, but accepting the deity of God, they're also totally lost. Because they're completely discounting the fact of what we have just been discussing all this time. And that's believing.
And when it talks in the Bible about, to be saved believing on the name of Jesus, well, believing on the name of Jesus means you are believing everything that the name of Jesus entails. not just intellectual, or, but it's, what does his name mean? What all does that entail? The whole person of Jesus. Because, like you said, if they're denying the deity,
Well, this is where, I'm sorry.
No.
where do you even go with that?
But
Because
I did want to call back to something you were talking about earlier. So there are going to be very large audiences that are going to, that we have the ability to do apologetics to, that will deny the deity of Jesus, but don't even call themselves Christians first, or Jewish brothers and sisters in the world, and also Muslims. So, and you were asking earlier, where then do all the prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament come into play, and that's exactly what we want to call to it. If you dig it up, there are a lot of apologists who do reach out to the Jewish and Muslim communities that are able to work with these Old Testament prophecies. And I'd recommend, if you all are interested in looking into it, like Michael Brown's a good figure if you're interested in reaching out to the Jewish community. And then I think we've talked about David Wood being another good example for reaching out to the Muslim community. But yeah, there are a number of different people who are going to push back against the deity of Jesus. Many Jews will acknowledge, in fact, almost all will acknowledge the existence of the historical Jesus, but they just believe him as being some crazy Joseph Smith character that to them, like, that started off Mormonism in contrast to how we are as Orthodox Christians.
Jehovah's Witnesses.
What's that?
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
They profess to be, well, another branch of it is Church of the Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ.
That's the
But
Mormons.
they don't believe in Christ.
Yeah. Well,
So
those are, but not as the deity
well,
of Christ. Yeah.
if you don't believe in the deity, you don't believe in Jesus.
Yeah.
You don't believe in Jesus as a deity, then you don't believe in Jesus. That's period.
Well, the historical Jesus or
It makes no difference which one you believe, unless you believe on the deity of Jesus. You don't believe in Jesus. You're believing he existed? My God. Yeah. You can believe. A lot of people existed.
Yeah.
You don't believe in them. According to what I've read, Buddha existed, but I don't believe in Buddha. That said,
Yeah.
to me, there's several theologies or churches or beliefs that call themselves Christian, but they are not.
I agree with you 100% on that. Yeah.
So that said, when we're witnessing, when we're practicing our apologetics, it makes no difference who you're believing or who you're talking to. Only the fact that you're trying to get them on board so they can be saved, so they can join us in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
That's bottom line.
I understand. Yeah.
All the rest is kind of like how, when, and where.
Yeah. But I want to still
And
draw
I
this.
understand what
Yeah.
you're doing.
Yeah. The distinction between evangelism and apologetics.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I agree with you. Your approach is evangelical and very powerful. I encourage you to use it. Opportunity. I'm trying to teach the apologetical part.
Yeah, that's why I'm here.
Yeah. That's where
Another tool in my chest.
Yeah. Most evangelists make the most effective apologists, but you have to know when you're stepping like into apologetic territory or when you're evangelical territory, and when is the best time to use either which one. So yeah, I agree with you. Yeah. Jesus, as we know by definition, is the incarnate Son of God, but there's some people who, that's where define your terms. What do you mean by when you say you believe in Jesus? That's a good defining term.
yeah,
Mhm. That's a great question. What do you mean by?
But I think you would take a different course of conversation if you're starting at ground zero, I don't believe at all, or, oh yeah, I believe the guy existed and he might have been crucified. Like you're starting a different,
Yeah.
it's find out where they are.
where they are.
Where they are, and then that would be your
Your entry point.
entry point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's really hard to start off with evangelical arguments. Typically, evangelical arguments aren't as much arguments. Once you get into argumentation, you're in apologetics. But when you do straight evangelical work, it's not as cut and dry for entry points into people who are completely anti-theist.
Man, I think that you that's great because people are gonna, well, this guy's a idiot. But then you start speaking truths or making truth claims, well, it's gonna, and because you're evangelizing, people will come. Well, I don't believe in that. That's where the apologetics would come in handy.
And you gotta dig deep.
Yeah.
Sure, and you have to understand that they're not the enemy. The enemy is the devil,
Right.
the deceiver, the accuser. We're there to spread the good news of Jesus, the gospel, and then to give a reason or give a defense of the reason we have hope. So,
Yeah.
But I also think there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? Like when I'm reading my book on an airplane
One of my
and someone,
who skins cats?
I hope that was.
We got Alpha over there.
when someone's asking,
He's always saying that.
but when someone was asking me about the book I was reading on the airplane, I might not necessarily start out with evangelism. I might start out with, well, this is what I'm reading,
There you go.
and you don't get into necessarily that deep conversation, but it may have gone the apologetic route as opposed to the evangelistic.
Yeah. That's always going to be, you have to know your audience. And, yeah.
Like with my coworkers, I don't think they started out with evangelism because
Well, you're going to get a lot of people. If you bring up God, a lot of people are like, well, I believe in God. No big deal.
Yeah.
You start bringing up the people's sin, and then you're going to have the issue.
Yeah.
Well, who do we sin against? Well, the God I worship loves everybody.
Yeah, then you're another defined terms argument. It's like, who is this God you speak of? And even as you're a Christian, you can push back in that way and get them to define who they think God is. And you're typically going to find out either an Orthodox Christian or there's somebody who just has an ideation of God that puts them above this concept they have that they call God. But yeah, these are all very good examples as to how to approach the evangelical versus an apologetical conversation. So it's going to be different in every regard. And yeah, I'm not going to say any of you are wrong on that, right? What?
May I ask how you approached it? When you ran into this person who was Christian that didn't believe in Jesus as the Son of God.
I started asking him who he thought Jesus was, what is, and then he was able to typically the good teacher argument, and then I was able to talk to him about the claims that Jesus made. Was this something of a good moral teacher? Because the concept where it was that Jesus is a good moral teacher up to and including like the ranks of Gandhi or the Buddha or something of that nature, and then get them to define who they think Jesus is, and then from there you're able to distinguish Jesus against who Gandhi was as a person or the Buddha was as a person. Gandhi's easy. He was a social activist, and then the Buddha was like a religious character from ancient history. So you're able to easily distinguish Jesus from Gandhi and the fact that Jesus wasn't a social activist in that he wasn't trying to improve the lives of first century Jews in the way that Gandhi was protesting against the British Empire and trying to make the lives of Indians at the time something better. And then with the Buddha, then you can work with the differences in religious beliefs of who the Buddha claimed he was, because then you can also use those claims where Buddhism is technically not a deistic religion or a theistic religion in the way that Christianity is. So now you've got that one claim that you're able to work with theism, and then Jesus is claimed to be God. So it's a series of arguments you have to work towards. Then you're defining your terms, but you're first just trying to make distinctions between their claims.
What was the result of the interaction?
Went away stubborn.
Pearls.
What?
Pearls.
Exactly. But I was able to break.
Give a defense of the reason.
Yeah, break apart the argument, but I also know where I was sitting at work at that time, other people were looking at the cubicles at the time.
But isn't it Paul that said somebody waters the next one?
Reaps, yeah.
So then, whenever you're doing something like that, believe me, it's in his hands.
Yeah, and that's
Well, it's always in his hands.
Well, always, but what I'm trying to say is, he took it part of the way, somebody else mentioned.
Yeah. All right, let's try to get to let's try to get us to the end of the this portion, and we'll go ahead and call it at night for the slide. So Jesus received worship, the kind of worship Jews only gave God. In Matthew 14:3, Peter gets out of the boat and walks in the water. Peter starts to sink. Jesus reaches out and saves him. And when they get into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You are certainly God's son." And in Matthew 28:17, it says, "And when they saw him, the risen Jesus, Christ, whom they knew had been dead and now alive, they worshipped him." And then in John 9:38, the man blind from birth is healed. Jesus said, "Lord, I believe." No, he said, the blind man, excuse me. And he worshipped him. In Hebrews 1:6, and when he again brings the firstborn into the world, he says, "And let all of the angels of God worship him." These verses show much more than mere respect, much more than deference, and much more than courtesy. Jesus is being worshipped. There are many times when the word proskuneo, means to worship, is used of Jesus and other men, and it doesn't refer to worship. The context tells us we look at the context. Oh, sorry, I'm not reading well. We looked at the context, and especially the use of the phrase falling down and worshiping. It seems hard to escape the conclusion that Jesus is being worshipped. Finally, Jesus' claim to be God was the reason the Jews arrested him and convinced Pilate to crucify him. In John 19, Pilate tells the Jewish leaders that he finds no guilt worthy of capital sentence. They answer Pilate, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God." And Jesus' violation of blasphemy is recorded in Luke 22:70-71, when he appeared before the council after his arrest. They had the evidence they needed from Jesus' own lips. Mark gives more details about this in 14:62-64. When Jesus answered them, the high priest tore his clothes and declared this was blasphemy. So I'm just going to skip all the way to the end here, because we are out of time. I had a good one on Jesus. Oh, I had a really good one on Jesus being just a moral teacher. This is a quote from C.S. Lewis, and I don't think we got enough time to get through anything else.
Oh, Lord, liar, lunatic.
Yeah, exactly that. Okay, here we go. This is the quote I want to go. Was Jesus just a great moral teacher? On the one side, clear, definitive moral teaching. On the other, claims which, if not true, are those of a megalomaniac, compared with whom Hitler was the most sane and humble of men. There is no halfway house, and there is no parallel in other religions. The idea of a great moral teacher saying that Christ said, what Christ said, is out of the question. In my opinion, the only person who can say that sort of thing is either God or a complete lunatic suffering from the form of delusion which undermines the whole mind of man. It is either lunacy or lies, or one turns to the Christian theory. That's from C.S. Lewis, from God of the Docs. But I wanted to be, does anybody want to go through this section, or do we want to be respectful of our time here? Like,
Go through the section.
okay. I'm going to skip past. Okay, it's not that many. Okay, so the question of Jesus' identity has perplexed and fascinated us since he arrived on the scene 2,000 years ago. In our own day, we seem to have a Jesus for everyone. Superhero Jesus, common guy Jesus, homosexual Jesus, traditional marriage Jesus, Democrat Jesus, Republican Jesus, Mormon Jesus, Oriental Jesus, and so on. So they were talking back here again about defining terms of what they mean by Jesus, and if it's not the Orthodox Jesus, it's not the true Jesus. So pick a cause or an agenda. There's been a Jesus, waiting on the wings, ready to offer his support. Why does everyone want a piece of Jesus? Yet so often, not the whole. That is, why are we so ready to ascribe to Jesus the status of a great moral teacher, a teacher whom we can use for our own personal or political agenda, yet we hesitate to call him Lord? Yeah, are you guys good with this view? And then the claim that Jesus was a great moral teacher is not a real option. He is a great moral teacher, but that is not all he is. If that is all he is, then he isn't even that. As C.S. Lewis famously pointed out, an honest look at the life of Jesus reveals that either Jesus was a god or was a madman. Okay, I already read you that, so we're past that book. greater disparity could there be between belief and reality? The moral authority of Jesus' teachings cannot be separated from his personhood and his self-identity. So see Matthew 7:21 through 23, where at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus claims to be the Lord of history, who will determine people's eternal destiny. And Matthew 7:24 through 29, where he affirms that unless we build our lives on his teachings, we will not hold up under the stress of life. And second, merely propounding moral propositions is a necessary condition for one's being a good moral teacher, but not sufficient conditions. Adolf Hitler could propound moral propositions, but an 8-year-old boy could too, but that would hardly make him a good moral teacher. In order to qualify as a great moral teacher, one's character is relevant too, not just the content of his teachings. In the gospel, Jesus asked his disciple the crucial question that all of us must answer. But what about you, he asked, who do you say that I am? This question has reverberated ever since Jesus asked it. We must all respond to this question. What do we make of Jesus? Let me suggest that whatever the answer, he did not allow the option of being just a great moral teacher. You must choose either a madman or God. Then we're going to get straight to our conclusion here. Let me zoom this up so y'all can see this. This is a lot for a slide. Oh, come on. The trial, crucifixion, death, and resurrection account has to be the most well-documented historical event of late antiquity and the most corroborated event in the Bible, whether through the accounts of the apostles or the supporting documents of those who opposed Jesus and his followers. The resurrection is the most transformative event in history, with its effect changing the world, not only through the lives of those who believe in Jesus, but also through the inexorable change that Jesus' work has accomplished in providing a means to have access to God, and the promise of salvation through his Son. So, the interesting thing is, the reason why I told you this is one of the easiest objections we have to counter in our whole apologetical approaches is the resurrection historicity of it. It claims that Jesus is God, is who he says he is, but it is also the hardest for the non-believers to believe. So it's interesting that we have such a wealth of preponderance of evidence that people don't want to believe. So then we have to then start asking our questions. Why then if this is something that is of such importance, as we have the famous Christopher Hitchens saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Why is it that you find this one claim so hard to follow? We have all this wealth of evidence. What is the holdup? Why do you find this to be so objectionable in your life? And then we typically have an opening to talk about different objections they have, typically personal, typically nature of evil, pain and suffering, or personal objections they have in their lives. I'm going to go ahead and cut this live feed so everybody say bye to Facebook.